He led his troops in more than 80 battles and won 90% of them, even under the most difficult circumstances. He carried the French flag high, but didn't speak its language until he was 10 years old. He helped decipher Egyptian hieroglyphics and transformed the Europe of his time. But above all, he was one of the most brilliant military minds in history. We're talking about Napoleon Bonaparte, the consul, emperor, and commander whose life and legacy continue to fascinate the world. In this new military history video, we'll review his incomparable career, from its beginnings to his spectacular rise to power, including his most iconic battles and his unparalleled strategic talent. Stay with us and discover why Napoleon Bonaparte was unstoppable.
He's one of the most influential military leaders of all time.
Napoleon was exceptional in that he was genuinely loved by his men.
From a relatively humble background, he rose to become master of Europe.
For somebody like that to become emperor, ruler of the largest empire that Europe had seen, really, since the Middle Ages, is just amazing.
Napoleon was born on August 15, 1769, on the island of Corsica, occupied by France, which had purchased the territory from the Republic of Genoa. The inhabitants were not happy with this decision. In fact, the parents of the future military strategist, a noble couple with limited resources, were part of the resistance that fought against the invaders. This, one might say, was Napoleon's first battle, while still in his mother's womb. However, at that time, France was one of the richest and most populous nations in Europe, so the Corsicans never stood a chance against them. Thus, Napoleon grew up resenting the invaders. For this reason, he felt great anger when, at the age of 9, his father sent him to a boarding school in France. The change for young Napoleon had been enormous. He hated being in a country where he felt completely foreign, not even knowing the language, as he only spoke Corsican and Italian. And although he learned quickly, he never lost the accent that betrayed his origins and made him the target of humiliation. However, this fueled his determination to excel and prove his worth. He graduated from military school at 16 and earned his first commission in the army as a second lieutenant in an artillery unit. The young Corsican absorbed everything he was taught, and in a short time he became one of the most capable soldiers in his unit. However, he encountered a problem. The promotions he deserved never came. French society was based on a strict hierarchy, where command positions were exclusive to the aristocracy, and Napoleon would always be held back by his heritage. Or so it seemed, until an event that would change everything: the French Revolution.
The social hierarchy that had governed French society for centuries was torn to shreds as revolutionists overthrew the monarchy and stripped the aristocracy of their privileges. King Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette were given the guillotine treatment. And France was declared a republic ruled by politicians elected by popular vote.
Political chaos and civil war provided the ideal setting for a promising young man to rise quickly. But that wasn't all. The rest of Europe's monarchies opposed the revolutionaries, feeling threatened by the regime change. Foreign powers therefore began to support the so-called royalist movements, defending the overthrown French crown. For this reason, there was a great demand for capable soldiers to lead the army against their countless enemies. And Napoleon finally had his chance to lead troops in 1793. He was appointed artillery commander at the siege of Toulon, a strategic port that had fallen to British and Spanish forces. The Corsican devised a bold plan to free the city from the siege, focusing his attacks on key points with pinpoint accuracy. He stormed a hilltop fort in the middle of the night and positioned all his cannons to point toward the enemy coalition ships blockading the place. The offensive resulted in a decisive victory for the Republic, but over time it would take on even greater significance, as it was the first battle won by Napoleon Bonaparte's ingenuity. Thanks to the maneuver that led to the destruction of the enemy's stronghold, he was promoted to brigadier general. At just 24 years old, he consolidated his reputation as an exceptionally talented commander and launched his career, which would reach another major milestone in October 1795.
to Napoleon Bonaparte.
I award you the rank of Brigadier General.
Long live the Republic! Long live the Republic! Long live the Republic! Long live the Republic!
However, Napoleon wouldn't have much time to celebrate. A large number of royalist fighters arrived in Paris to attack the government in the French capital, and the desperate search for a leader to lead an unequal fight fell on him. The commander had less than 24 hours to prepare his men, but it was enough to devise a plan worthy of his reputation. The enemy coalition was vastly superior in numbers, with a 5-to-1 advantage, but Napoleon used his handful of troops wisely. He positioned soldiers at key points around the government palace and deployed artillery in strategic sectors to create a zone where the royalist assaults could be suppressed. In this way, he employed a brutal but effective tactic, the use of cluster shrapnel. These projectiles managed to demoralize and disperse the enemy with minimal casualties among his own ranks. Napoleon lost fewer than 100 of his men, while the enemy suffered at least 3 times as many casualties. This event not only ensured the continuity of the revolutionary government, but also demonstrated the Corsicans' ability to make quick decisions under pressure. Paris's reaction was one of awe and gratitude. Napoleon had saved the city, and he once again displayed impressive leadership that, at the age of 26, led him to become a general-in-chief in command of the French army in northern Italy. This new victory was sealing his destiny. However, this was difficult to predict before the campaign began. The army now under Bonaparte's command was relatively small, numbering around 20,000 men. But the most complex aspect of the situation he encountered was that these soldiers were poorly supplied and severely neglected compared to some of the other fronts where more fighting had taken place. Often malnourished and living in poor conditions, the men's motivation was at rock bottom. But it was at this point that Napoleon not only emerged as a great strategist, but also an incredible leader. He presents himself as the savior, telling his troops, who are in that place without money or food, that Italy is full of riches and glory, and together they will seize them. From that moment on, this was the spirit the campaign adopted, a blend of almost piratical motives with the goal of representing France and its ideals with victory. The speed with which the Corsican turned these dispirited combatants into killing machines allowed him to immediately go on the offensive. And despite often being outnumbered, his great battle vision transformed them into an invincible force. Swift and surprising maneuvers to divide the enemy allowed him to win 19 of 21 battles against the Austrian armies, and thus France achieved dominance of northern Italy.
Napoleon's a great battlefield leader. He's a great military leader in the narrow sense. What he also starts to show during the years in Italy is his very strong conviction of himself as being entitled to be a political leader as well, of being entitled to be treated almost as a monarch. And while he's there in Milan, he bases himself in what is effectively a palace.
Napoleon displayed his charisma and strategic ability at their finest during the Italian campaign. He had gone from commanding a group of battered soldiers to leading a conquering power and forcing Austria to sign the Peace of Campo Formio. This treaty ended the so-called First Coalition, forcing all the countries that had united against France to accept defeat. All except one, Great Britain. The British remained the imperialist power, with territories across the globe, which they exploited to fill their coffers with untold riches. However, Bonaparte was determined to seize that position. On October 17, 1797, he returned to Paris and handed over to Paul Barras, the French leader, the peace agreement he had negotiated without the authorization of his government.
It was the impressive list of all his conquests. Thanks to him, the French Republic laid its hands on the Duchy of Savoy, the County of Nice, northern Italy, and also Belgium, and the part of Germany that was left of the Rhine. In all its history, the French territory had never been this spread out. Paul Barras was frightened by the political dimension Napoleon now took on. his little protégé had become the greatest threat to his power.
Given this situation, Barras did not hesitate to immediately support a plan that seemed like madness. An offensive against Great Britain across the English Channel would be impossible without a naval fleet capable of confronting his enemies. However, to weaken his great rival, Napoleon decided to attack it indirectly by occupying Egypt, a key route to India. His expedition began on May 19, 1798, when he set sail with 40,000 soldiers and a remarkable contingent of 200 scientists. Bonaparte had recently received an appointment from the French Academy of Sciences, and he realized that this new role gave him the opportunity to present his invasion not as a war of expansion, but as an expedition of enlightenment. But despite what may have sounded like an excuse, while the troops were fighting, that group of scholars made discoveries of great historical significance, such as the Rosetta Stone, which would prove to be the key to deciphering ancient hieroglyphics and give rise to the field of Egyptology. Beyond this, Napoleon was focused on remaining Europe's deadliest weapon. At the Battle of the Pyramids, Bonaparte used square formations to defeat a Mamluk army 3 times his size. The battle was incredibly uneven, with only 289 losses for the French and more than 10,000 for his enemies. Everything seemed to be going perfectly for the Corsican, but he was unaware of the plans of his true rival. British Admiral Horatio Nelson had been searching for Napoleon's fleet, and when he found it docked in Alexandria, he completely destroyed it. Now the famous soldier found himself isolated, unable to return to France. Therefore, he decided to do what he knew best. In 1799, he launched a military campaign toward Syria. However, he faced fierce resistance, disease, and fatigue among his troops. At the Siege of Acre, his advance was finally halted, marking one of the few failures of his career. After suffering heavy losses, Napoleon returned to Egypt and, in a bold move, abandoned his army and secretly returned to French soil, where political chaos reigned. At that moment, he saw his opportunity.
On the 9th of November 1799, he gathered his closest allies and overthrew the French government in a coup d'etat, installing himself as first consul and ruler of France. The French Revolution was officially over, and rather than an all-powerful monarch, France now had an all-powerful Napoleon in charge instead.
As leader of France, Bonaparte reorganized his forces and ordered a confrontation with the Second Coalition. While he had been in Egypt, the Austrians reoccupied part of the territory in northern Italy. While one might think that as a ruler, Napoleon would leave this task to his men, this was not the case. He himself led a massive army that crossed the Swiss Alps and surprised the Austrian forces. As expected, the great strategist achieved a victory that consolidated his rule and marked the beginning of an era of French military supremacy. This time, even Great Britain accepted the call for an agreement, and for the first time in more than 10 years, Europe was at peace. The power the Corsican had achieved was unimaginable, and this also led him to encounter more and more enemies. He suffered several assassination attempts and began to imagine what would happen if one of the attempts were successful. Bonaparte had to ensure that his legacy continued even after he was gone. So as the undisputed leader, he made the decision to name himself Emperor of France.
Where Napoleon very famously crowns himself, that he would not give up to anyone else the right to put the crown on his head. So he takes it from the hands of the Pope and puts it on his own head.
In just 10 years, Napoleon Bonaparte went from an unknown artillery officer to the emperor of the largest empire Europe had seen in 1,000 years. His ambition did not stop there.
By 1812, the French Empire spanned most of the continent, and Napoleon had installed several members of his family on various thrones across Europe. However, there were still 2 notable absences from his growing collection of countries: Great Britain and Russia. To help fight what were now continental wars, Bonaparte invented the concept of mass conscription, drawing troops from all French-occupied territories. At its peak, the army numbered some 600,000 men, almost 5 times the number of British troops at the time. Being such a large force, the Corsicans also created the idea of military corps, dividing combatants into groups that could operate independently, being faster and more flexible.
Europe was powerless against him. During his reign, he deleted the Holy Roman Empire, a dynasty that had stood for over 1,000 years, defeated the powerful Austrian Empire no fewer than 4 times, and won countless battles when outnumbered and outgunned, often suffering miraculously minor casualties.
With his innovative ideas, Napoleon embarked on a campaign in Russia with 500,000 soldiers. The great strategist was confident, but he didn't know what awaited him. The Russians knew his reputation and didn't confront him. They fled toward the center of the country, burning everything in their path. This scorched earth tactic left the French troops without any way to obtain supplies as they moved further and further away from their territory. Finally, Bonaparte reached Moscow and took the capital without much effort. The problem was that by then, he and his men had been isolated and the harsh winter was approaching. Suddenly, everything descended into chaos. The return home was a great challenge against hunger and disease. Of the 500,000 men who had begun the expedition, only 40,000 returned alive. And as if that weren't enough, a new and fierce battle awaited him. His enemies had formed a new alliance, and Napoleon's weakened troops began a bitter campaign in Germany until they were defeated at the Battle of Leipzig. Forced to abdicate, the Corsican was exiled to the island of Elba in 1814. But there he built a small army and returned to France, where Louis VI, brother of the last monarch who had been guillotined, reigned. He sent a large number of men to destroy Napoleon, but he didn't realize that these soldiers adored him, and they deserted to join him. The same happened to a second group of fighters who disobeyed the king's orders and joined Bonaparte, who strengthened, returned to power in 1815 during the period known as the 100 Days. However, the enemy alliance was waiting for him once again. This time, Bonaparte faced the British and Prussian armies in what is now Belgium. Despite achieving a major breakthrough with an inferior force, the Battle of Waterloo ended in failure for the Corsican, and that would be his final day. To prevent him from returning, he was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena. There, Napoleon spent his final days reflecting on his legacy. Although his conquests ended in defeat, his military genius and influence on European politics shaped the modern world. He not only changed the way war was waged, but also left an indelible mark on history as a leader whose ambition challenged the limits of what was possible. And now, after learning about his enormous journey, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you for following us to the end. We look forward to seeing you in our next video.